Of course, all of you know Giles Tillotson, who is a renowned scholar of the 19th century in many different areas, not only on etchings and prints and paintings, but also in architecture. And in fact, he's a scholar of Indian art. He was working with the Jaipur Museum earlier. And it's a great honor to have Giles and to be in conversation with him about this really unique exhibition that I hope all of you have had a chance to go through and look at in detail, because it begs the question that how was India represented, and the kind of assumptions that were made about us as a culture, as a civilization, which was then consumed by the Western imagination. And of course, there were many issues that were at play here, because it was not just the fact that it was an exotic country, but I'm sure that the fact that it's about the Hindus. And even though the Muslims were the elites, the Muslims were othered in this text, if you look at it. And was that a part, something that I'd like Giles to address at some point, was that a way of dealing with the fact that the Muslims were the main, among the major adversaries of the British, because they were the rulers, or among the majority of the rulers? It's also probably impacted by the fact that there was a civilizational clash between Islam and Christianity in the Crusades. Did that impact some of the understanding of Muslims in India? Because Muslims are not at all projected, and neither are any other, there are a few, the Burmese, etc., who are in some of the etchings. But the fact that Indians were read as Hindus, and that was the civilization that was presented. And it's also very interesting, and I think that is what Giles is going to talk about, that it was not the Hindus who were the rich merchant princes, but it was the Hindus who were the working class. So, and there were many reasons, of course, for it. And there's a wonderful book that Giles has done. So if you want to know more about it, with all the plates, this is only a selection of the plates, but all the plates are in the book. You might want to get the book. So welcome, Giles, and welcome to all of you. And I'm going to hand it over to you and ask you questions, stop you and ask you questions as we go along.
Thank you very much, Tasneem. And welcome everybody to this exhibition, which, as Tasneem says, is a collaboration between Baltazard and DAG, which has a gallery in Delhi, but also another one, some of you may be aware, in Mumbai itself, in the Taj, where just at the moment we have a different Bengali exhibition up, a very different view of Bengal. It's Kalighat and early oil paintings representing Bengali art of the late 19th, early 20th centuries. All of that is art made by Bengali artists for Bengali consumption. You get a very different view of Bengal here, which, as Tasneem says, is produced by a foreigner, by a European resident in Bengal at a slightly earlier period, about 100 years before, at the end of the 18th century. Let me just sketch for you briefly his story, and then we'll start to fill in some of the details and address the problems that Tasneem has raised. So he's born in Antwerp in 1760. He trains originally as a marine painter. Bear in mind, Antwerp, of course, a very rich trading city, lots of commercial shipping coming in and out. So you'd think he'd have a good career doing that. But at the age of 30, he throws it all up and gets on a ship and sails to Calcutta and spends the next decade living in Calcutta, so the last 10 years of the 18th century. And that really shapes everything we know about him. That is, all of his known work really relates to that, to that period. While he's in Calcutta, he has the idea of doing a series of images that he's going to draw but then disseminate in print form, representing Indian society, and he uses the terms Indian and Hindu interchangeably. So that's one of the first difficulties. Representing, and of course it's Bengal, but it's Greater Bengal. I mean, he's seeing people who come from what's now Bangladesh, then East Bengal, from Orissa, from Bihar, but he's seeing them on the streets of Calcutta. But he wants to try to do this encyclopedic, as he thinks, representation of Indian society, with a soft H at the beginning of that word, in that period. Why would he want to do that? I think one of the first things you have to try to get your head around, which is very difficult for us because we live in a world that is absolutely saturated with images all the time. We see 1,000 a day on our own phones. What you have to realize is at the end of the 18th century, Europe, despite its already long association with India in terms of trade and conquest, had no visual idea of India at all. The first people to represent landscape were William Hodges and Thomas Daniel. Up until that, people in Britain or in France would have heard of the Taj Mahal. Nobody had the faintest idea what it looked like because they had seen no image of it. And so the idea of an artist coming to India to represent, in Daniel's case, the architecture and landscape, in Solvyns' case, the people, was, as it were, supplying a visual imagery, evidence, or information to their compatriots. So this is art made for a European audience 200 years ago, which indeed begs the question why we're putting it on show here now for you. It wasn't made for a 21st century Indian audience. It was made for in this case, early 19th century English and French audience. I think the key part to his story, let me just finish the narrative. He embarks on this great project while he's living in Calcutta. He can't find local expertise to help him with the engraving, so he learns to do it himself. He doesn't do it very well. It's hard. They're very different skills, drawing and engraving. And although other artists of the period did do both, Hodges did both, Thomas Daniel did both, his first edition that he produces in Calcutta while he's there in the 1790s is a little crude. We have 2 pages from it in a cabinet display. Financially, it's a complete flop. He thinks it's going to be bought up by the Europeans resident in Calcutta. They're unimpressed. So the only sensible thing to do is to find a very rich woman to marry and to go home to Europe, which is what he does, and he then spends his wife's fortune on doing it all over again in Paris. And he increases the number of plates from 250 to 288. He writes a much more extensive descriptive text. All of the plates are accompanied by a page of description of what's going on that's bilingual, French and English. Obviously, his wife is helping him with the French. And that's a commercial failure too. One of the reasons it's a commercial failure is by then it's just too expensive. It's too big and ambitious. If you think the people who've been successful with their prints, one of the largest series is Thomas and William Daniel's Oriental Scenery, Landscape Views. That had 144 prints. Hodges was pretty successful with Select Views. That had 48. 288? It's just too expensive. It's too big and too many. And he should have learnt this lesson because in between the failed Calcutta edition and the not terribly successful French one, a very enterprising English publisher called Orme, the brothers William and David Orme, had plagiarized him. They got hold of a copy of the Calcutta thing and they thought there's a good idea here, but the artist doesn't know what he's onto. What we're going to do is we're going to take 60 of his images, copy them, make them a little prettier and smaller, cut down the text a bit, and reissue this as a book, which they did, which sold very well. And Orme, of course, was absolutely furious when he saw this. He said, this is a violation of my work and of my name. But he doesn't learn the lesson. Instead of producing his own book of 60 images, he doesn't reduce the number, he increases it. So I'm afraid we're looking at, it's a slightly sad way of introducing him initially, the story of an artist who is a financial failure. And I think part of the failure also is to do with the image of India that he shows us, that it's quite raw at times. It's not picturesque. It's not easy. It certainly wasn't easy on the eye for his contemporaries. I think perhaps we're more used to being confronted by art rather than by being pleased by it.
Right. And just to sort of elaborate, I don't know if most of you know what the picturesque tradition was. It was, it was mostly landscape and buildings, and it was the scenes were prettified in a sense, because again, they were catering to a certain idea of what the Orient was. And so it was very exotic, very beautiful, mostly architecture. This was the first time that people were represented. And it's interesting that he decided, as I was saying earlier, to represent the working classes. And maybe you want to speak about that, Giles. Why did he decide to represent mainly the working classes?
Okay, well, my reading of him is this, that the circumstances in which he comes to India, I think, determine what he does. For a European like him to go and live in Calcutta, you can't just get on a boat and go, which is what he did. You're supposed to get permission from the Court of Directors of the East India Company in London, in Leadenhall Street. He neglected, it's like getting a passport. He neglected to do that. He then compounded the fault by actually traveling on the ship that belonged to a ship's captain who was English, but was already deliberately undercutting the monopoly of the East India Company. So he was essentially being not quite a pirate, but acting illegally. So when Solvyns arrives in Calcutta, they don't actually kick him out, but he's not accepted into European society. He's not, as it were, welcomed. So he doesn't move very much within the European society of his time. There are two images around the corner, actually, which very starkly compare Blacktown with the European city of Calcutta. They're two different worlds. And so he's thrown very much into the Indian city of Calcutta. And he spends his 10 years living much more among Indian people than any other European of his time would have done. So at one level, that's a huge advantage. There's a downside to it, which we'll come to. But the huge advantage is that precisely because he's not moving amongst his compatriots, he's thrown more amongst Indians of all levels of society in the street. And that's what gives him the idea that he can do this kind of encyclopedic representation of Indian society.
Right. Should we talk about particular images?
Yes, all right. Let's start off with some of the portraits. Let's go through to the next room then. Yeah. But in passing, so the two pictures here. This is the so-called Ville Noire, or Black Town, of Calcutta, which is Chitpur, essentially. This is obviously the heart of the European city of Calcutta. Lal Bazaar, I can't remember what it's now called, and the roads still exist. None of the buildings depicted here still exist, but you have a sense of the Georgian city of Calcutta and the very different worlds that these represent. Okay, but if we can go into that room, we'll start with the people. So these are all hand-colored prints, by the way. So they're all etchings, which again he's done himself, and then he's hand-colored them with watercolor. And originally they would have been issued loose leaf, but any patron buying the set would then have them bound, and they're bound with the pages of text in between them. And you see that there are basically two formats. They're this sort of slightly bigger than A4 upright format. And then the other ones, some of the ones at the beginning are twice the size. And in the book, they're folded. They're double plates. Okay,
did the form itself constrain him in terms of the colors that he could use, and because he was not familiar with the technique, as you were saying earlier? Or because it is a very subdued palette? And that was, as you said, one of the reasons that it was not successful. Yeah. So why would you say that he used such a monotone, subdued palette?
I think it's just the aesthetic of the
Of
time.
that.
Yes, I mean, there is certain highlights of colour in some of them.
Right.
So let me address though this question that Tasneem raised about the European gaze, and make it a little bit more complicated. I think because anyone who's went to college in the last 40 years will have read Edward Said. So we're all hardwired to think that any European representation of any part of Asia has got to, at some level, be wrong, at fault, a misrepresentation, a construction, whatever term you want to use. The question I want to ask you is, what are the terms of that construction? Because if you think of a much earlier period, again, so to quote a famous book, if any of you ever read Parter Mitter's very famous early book called Much Maligned Monsters, he was talking there about a period when European artists represented Indian subjects, but where the artists had never been to India. They were doing pictures of Indian gods based on verbal descriptions, written descriptions by travelers. So obviously it's completely wild and lunatic. But I'd explained to you that Solvyns lived in Calcutta for 10 years. He can't, have gone around with his eyes closed. So he is looking, at least. There's a world of difference between an artist who's never been to India and one who's lived here for 10 years. So if there are questions or challenges in his representation of Indian society, what's the root of that? Where's he getting it from? He's not just sitting back in Antwerp making it all up, as earlier artists had done. He's based in Calcutta. Let me give you a different example to get closer to what I think is going on with Solvyns. Tasneem mentioned I've done a lot of work in my career in Rajasthan. And whenever this comes up, somebody will tell me there's a very famous early 19th century, slightly later than Solvyns, but early 19th century, Scottish actually, historian of Rajasthan called James Todd. Many of you will have heard of James Todd's Annals and Antiquities of Rajasthan. And what I'm told endlessly is, Todd had this very romantic vision of Rajasthan. He made up all these stories. It's all complete fiction. Well, no. If you actually look at Todd's career, he spent his time in Rajasthan collecting historical manuscripts and studying them with local learned pundits. And much of Annals and Antiquities are straight translations of texts that he bought in Rajasthan. Does that make it a skewed and romantic view of Rajasthani history? Well, yes, actually, because what he's doing is he's buying up wholesale the Rajput view of Rajasthan. He's just regurgitating what the Rajputs thought of themselves and believing it. He's uncritical of his source material. And I think we can make the same accusation of Solvyns, if accusation is the right word. This is the downside of him living entirely in Indian society. Who are his informants going to be? They're going to be the most learned men that he can find, Bengali Brahmins. And they give him a very Bengali Brahmin view of the world. So when Tasneem mentioned the absence of Muslims, we might add the absence of women very predominantly. Absolutely. There are a few women. Why do you think that is? It's because his chief informants, and when you read the text, he has a strongly Brahminical view of how Indian society is structured, and there's nothing to challenge that. Now, here's the irony, and you might think it's doubly ironic, it's an Englishman telling you this, but had he, for example, been allowed to attend meetings of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, and he'd gone along and he'd told them, the Englishmen, what he thought of Manusmriti and what he'd been told about Manusmriti, then the English would have said, no, you've got that slightly wrong. Manusmriti is not the same thing as Hinduism, I know that some Brahmins might think that and they might tell you that, but that's not the case. William Jones translated the laws of Manu. We know all about that, and we know, its limitations. You have to think critically about your sources. He never learned to do that.
But that's interesting, is it? Because William Jones is the one who, in fact, instigated him or encouraged him to put this whole collection together. So,
well, they're hoping that something positive will come out of it.
He didn't interact with William Jones to talk about his views, etc.
No, he's on his own.
It was on his own completely and dependent on his local sources.
So let's start with just the first 6 images. So a lot of them, the book, it's in 4 huge volumes. He starts off with a whole series of portraits of individuals. You'd not be surprised to hear that they're arranged hierarchically by caste. So we're going to start off with 3 Brahmins. The first 3 plates are well, there are 5 Brahmins. Just ethnologically, it's interesting that there are Brahmins from different parts of the country that are living and working in Calcutta at the time. So he distinguished them as a, this is a Bengali kind of Brahmin. I don't know how to pronounce it, actually. Is anyone, Shrutriya. Does anyone, have I got a Bengali here? But the Drauba, his captions are him transliterating Bengali into French, which is a rather difficult thing to get back into any known language. But Drauba, we believe to be Dravida. This is a South Indian Brahmin, yeah? This was easier, Oriya. He's an Orishi Brahmin. Okay, so if we start off with 3 Brahmins, then you're going to go down a rung, and he has 2 kings. But you would think that then we'd be looking at 2 Kshatriyas. Except that, well, actually, no. The first king is the Raja of Krishnanagar, who was, in fact, a Brahmin. I mean, he was a Raja, but he was a Brahmin. And these are types. These are people that he's met who stand for a class. He's sitting for himself. It's a portrait of an actual individual. And this particular Raja was a very pious man. This is, in one sense, one of the most interesting plates in the book, though, this one. Because what he tells us this is the Raja of Tanjore. So the first question you have to ask yourself is, what's the Raja of Tanjore doing in Calcutta? He's very adamant that all of the pictures are done from life, that he has met, he's seen all of the people that are depicted in these. So you think, but hang on, he didn't go to Tanjore. And the Raja of Tanjore never went to Calcutta, so how's he done this? And actually, if you know anything about the history of Tanjore in this period, we're at the end of the 18th century, the Raja of Tanjore was a very famous to us, guy called Sarfoji, who in the 1790s was young. He was in his 20s. This is not him. And if you do a little bit of kind of Google research with images, it's not hard to find that actually he's made this picture by copying another painting. So it's kind of, not really at first hand, it's at one remove. And the painting that is copied is a portrait of Nawab Ali Wadi Khan. Yeah. He's got the wrong guy. And he tells us in the text, all of the costumes, all of the trappings of this court, very typical of a Hindu court. Very unlike the Islamic courts of northern India. No, he's just got it wrong. So you have an elite Muslim uniquely has crept into the book by subterfuge.
Right.
This is the Kshatriya, who to him, I mean, again, this was a surprise to me. Because of Rajasthan, I think of Kshatriyas as Rajput warriors. Here he's a landlord, a Calcutta landlord. He then goes into a whole series relating to occupations. So again, there's this sort of interplay between caste and occupation. And again, you have to ask yourself, I know that there is post-colonial critical thinking which supposes that the British made it all up. But here is an 18th century Netherlander finding a correlation between caste and occupation. And he's being told that this is how society is organized. So you have the Daibak is an astronomer, what he calls Korsto, which is the Kayast. This is a migrant community actually at the time in Calcutta who have particularly found employment as clerks in working for European traders. So it's not surprising that you see him. Obviously, the clients of the astronomer are going to be Indian and Hindu. He's working for a European. He's represented in a European environment. And yes, as Tasneem says, he quite quickly goes down the social ladder to agriculturalist, to a milkman, to a gardener, to a weaver, to a shankari is someone who makes ornaments out of conch shells using this particular weird shaped
So he
blade.
talks, Giles, also about the fact that whatever he depicts, is as he sees, and that it's completely scientifically accurate. And he hasn't made it up in the sense that he's not copying or following the picturesque tradition, which is to embellish. And yet when I look at these paintings, I find very much a certain type depicted. You know, they're all sort of strong, very much in a sort of the Grecian idea of the figure, and sorry, my voice, and they're all dark, which is not really the case with all Indians. And if you look at them carefully, I was looking at them and thinking, you know, given the fact that he claims to be very scientific in his depiction, I actually find, I mean, they're wonderful images, you know, in the sense that what they're trying to depict, and maybe they are depicting accurately exactly what the dress and the furniture and the accoutrements were. But I find that the typology is very much cast in a particular lens, in a particular interpretation. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, so this idea of accuracy or fidelity, again, is a very important value of the period. Artists like him or Thomas Daniel or William Hodges, they don't talk about self-expression. They don't, in their writing, and Hodges particularly writes extremely eloquently about what he thinks he's doing. What he thinks he's doing and what Solvyns thought he was doing was contributing to an Enlightenment exploration and exposition of Indian civilization and Indian society. So it's informational. If you look at prints by Hodges, in every single one it says drawn on the spot and engraved by William Hodges, and the on the spot matters in exactly the same way as Solvyns claimed to have met everybody that he portrays, except the Raja of Tanjore. This idea of first-hand knowledge is important. But obviously, yes, it's filtered then through a lens of artistic training. And yes, the way in which he sees the male body is very much modeled on a European Renaissance ideal.
Yes, understanding. It's very interesting to see that, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the question is, are there areas of ethnographic information that we can still use? And yes, there are. Let me find some. Well, first of all, behind you, this is skipping on a bit, this is to volume 2, but there are 12 plates on that wall there, all depict musical instruments, some of which are things that will be very familiar to us, some of which a bit less so. So top left is a tampura, bottom right is a sort of country cousin of the Chennai. Some of them are now obsolete, but we know from other sources that they existed, like that fantastic great curved horn in the middle at the bottom, known as a serpent. Some of which we still know a bit about that are obscure, like the Jal Tarang, the saucers full of water. And
can I just add that he says that the tabla is used by the Nautch girls, and he talks about Nautch girls in a rather sort of typical European understanding. It's sort of denigrating it in a sense. And the tabla was therefore an instrument. I think Zakir Saab would be completely horrified if he realized that the tabla was associated initially in his understanding with Nautch girls, and therefore he dismissed the tabla in a sense. And so there are these very interesting ideas that come through of how he's reading Indian society. And you have to understand that this is then disseminated, it becomes a kind of classic, and it's disseminated all over Europe and becomes a point of reference for other artists, including Indian artists that I'm sure Giles will talk about. And therefore his interpretation also becomes one that, in a sense, influences again how Indian society is read, how these images are consumed. And I mean, his whole idea of women is just, I think it's quite outrageous. Giles.
Should
I don't know if you want
should we
to
try
talk
and get to
about
some of the women? So these are some of the bottom end of the social spectrum among the men, the toddy tapper, the nai or barber. This is a patois. It's actually, so here's a case of something that's actually ethnographically interesting. A patois is a painter of scrolls. When we were doing, preparing the other exhibition I mentioned, the Babu and the Bazaar, my colleague Shotdeep Mehta, who did a lot of work on that, we were talking about the way in which Kalighat painting connects up eventually with patois painting, with scroll painting, with a folk tradition. But how do we represent this? There's no known image of a patois painter from an early period. Yes, there is. There's this. This is the earliest painting of a Bengali painter. But so, and then we get right down to the bottom to the mochi and the swineherd and so on at the bottom of the rung. And again, so then the focus on the lower end I find interesting because you're not getting this very much in Indian painting at this time. We're at the end of the 18th century. So if you think of court painting, typically it's the Raja on a terrace with a dancing girl or a musician, or the noble, the Thakur, and so on. It's very, very much the elite members of society, except perhaps for a few attendants. Nobody's turning the focus onto the underclass. And so he's really the first person to do that. I'll leave you to explore some more of these. Again, here's an interesting misunderstanding here. This one is labeled Sikhs. It's a Sikh. And I think it's perhaps a measure of how small the Sikh community was in Calcutta at the time. He's very confused about who the Sikhs are. And so he asks people, his Bengali Brahmin friends, who are the Sikhs, and they said, well, they're all descended from Timur, but they converted to Hinduism, which is kind of wrong on all sorts of levels. And that's what that's all he's able to tell us about Sikhs. He keeps starting again and going up the top. So he does it by caste, he does it by profession, then he starts all over again by costume, by dress. And here, finally, you start getting some women. So you have an elite woman, femme de distinction, an elite woman. But yes, as Tasneem says, he's very disparaging about her because he says, well, given her ornaments and her splendor, she's obviously a kept woman. She's not really, she's not a woman, a wife who is modeling her behavior as she should on the tenets of Manusmriti. So she must be essentially a kept woman of some rich man.
Can I just tell them what the tenets of Manusmriti, as he interpreted it to be, was that the end goal of a good Brahmin wife was to produce children and to serve her husband. And she had no other objective except to please her husband and produce children. So this was his understanding, and if she was good, that's all she did. And at one point, he also, I think in one of these images of the portraits of women, he says that her life is as good as a vegetable. She's a piece of vegetation, in the sense that he actually absorbs and accepts this interpretation. It's very interesting coming from Europe that he accepts this interpretation of women. I don't know. I mean, what do you feel about that? That he's not critical again. I'm sure that in Europe, women were much more emancipated at that time.
Yes,
but you're right, it's a very uncritical gaze. It doesn't come through, but it comes through in many other aspects. He's critical about other things. But the role of women and the way he's interpreting it is not necessarily correct. He's not using a sort of, other ways of interpreting or understanding.
And you're right, I think he's been too long in Calcutta. He goes back with his rich wife, he goes back, lives in Paris.
Right.
And he produces all of these prints. They're all printed in Paris between 1808 and 1812. We're talking about post-revolutionary France.
Right.
At one point, he uses the word complacent of a woman approvingly.
Yes.
She's complacent, meaning she's happy with her lot. This is a good condition for a woman to be in. But there's one little bit of kickback, which I think, again, is sort of ethnographically interesting. This is a female renouncer, an Agori, and his male Brahmin informants tell him, no such thing. A woman can't be a renouncer. And he says, yeah, I've met 3. So you're wrong on that. So he puts one in. So there's a tiny little bit of kickback. Alongside all of these portraits, there are scenes representing festivals and ceremonies and so on. So at the entrance to the exhibition, there's a whole series there that you should go back and look at. Some of them are very familiar. Obviously, this is Durga Puja. This is the Kali temple, the Kali Ghat temple, as it was before. If any of you've been there, as you see it now, it was substantially rebuilt about 10 years after he was there. I think in 1813, it was substantially rebuilt, the temple, and what you see now actually is an extension of that. So this is just architecturally an important thing. Here's a Nauch taking place in a rich man's house. And yeah, so other European representations of Nauches would very much be, there's some, for example, by Charles Doyley in Tomwell the Griffin, where what you see is a Nauch being staged by a British patron for an Indian guest. So it's taking place in a Western palace. Here you get the Nauch, as it were, native style, in a rich man's house. And again, you have to kind of sift the information that you're getting from this, about the kinds of instruments that we used, for example, in a Nauch. You have to be able to sift that from his interpretation and his idea about what Indian music is and what the Nauch is, where again, you can hear very often his Brahmin informants. He has the idea, for example, that there is a kind of entirely pure Hindu form of music, which is completely disconnected from the music of India's Muslim courts. Now, I'm not a musicologist, but I know enough to know that that is complete baloney, that you can't disentangle the history of Hindustani music into religious traditions. Obviously, there are particular kinds of musical event, and he describes some of those like performances in praise of Krishna, which have a Hindu element. But the notion that you can distinguish the instruments, the styles of dance, the costumes, and so on into 2 discrete categories is just not true.
So I just want to say, in terms of his interpreting one, of course, the Nauch, as Giles rightly says, that he considered that completely degenerate and that it was influencing Indian culture. But he also thought that the Rats, the Krishna Rats, or the celebration of Ras Leela and Radha Krishna, which sometimes involved, that's what he says at that time, maybe in certain parts of where he was living, certain sexual acts. Maybe it was tantric, or he's not quite clear. But you can see this European fascination with the idea that Indian society was so free and open in its expression of sexuality. So even when he depicts the Rath, he doesn't show the sculptures on the Rath because they were what he considered lascivious. So it's again bringing that European gaze and looking at the idea of sexuality as being something that was primitive and needed to be controlled. So it's a very interesting dichotomy that you find in painters and in thinkers of that time also, where and Hegel brings this up, where I think he does with and Partha alludes to it, that there's such an elevated thought, and then you look at the practice, and the practice is so sensual in a sense, and trying to kind of resolve that dichotomy. And sometimes, they just elide, they just don't address it, or they'll make a comment, and the two seem to exist simultaneously. I don't know, what do you think, Giles? This fascination with the sensuality of Indian culture.
But as you say, sort of distaste for some of its representations. There's a scene of a night performance of a Krishna Lila, which he says, the more respectable members of society don't attend because it's accompanied by lascivious behavior. Not that he doesn't show it, of course, but there is nothing more fascinating to the European gaze in the late 18th century than sati. Bear in mind, of course, this is before its banning in Bengal in 1829, so long before. And I think in the early period, in his period, in the end of the 18th century, there is a certain element of buy-in to the idea that this is a heroic act, which is not, as it were, to condone it, but to say that there is an inherent, well, obviously physical bravery involved in it. And so this depiction of a woman, young woman, it's always a young and pretty woman in Western representations of it. One could cite Zoffany and Hodges. Nobody paints an elderly widow being taken to the pyre. It's here being led by Brahmins to her husband's funeral pyre. And this is kind of morally neutral in a sense. Later representations begin to turn to suggest that there's something horrific about to happen here. This is much more of a kind of calm neoclassical, even does the composition suggest something much more of something out of antiquity. The picture next to it, though, has an ethnographic element interest to it, because this is something that is largely forgotten. Though I've confirmed from an anthropologist, historical anthropologist, that it is true that there was a particular community of weavers in Bengal who buried their dead. They didn't cremate their dead, so that when a woman became sati, she was buried alive, not burnt alive. And so he represents that. And again, just as a bit of documentation of a historical practice that is now, thankfully, obsolete. There it is. I think I'm going to lead you back into the room, but before you go, so notice that the Ramjani in the middle at the top is a dancer on her own, who's kind of borrowed from the Nauch, and the delightful Baluk, the dancing boy in the bottom left, is one of those who is dressed specifically for a dance performance relating to the life of Krishna, hence his peacock crown. There's a whole series of ascetics as well, of which I've put two there. Can we move back into the other room? So there are a few things I want to point out. In this case, we have two pages from the Calcutta edition. And you can see how much cruder they are than the ones on display, the ones he did later in Paris, particularly if you find the corresponding images on the walls to make the comparison. There are two more series of works that give us lots of information about the material culture of late 18th century Calcutta. One is a whole series on transport, so we've just put up 6 of those plates with one ox-drawn cart, one horse-drawn cart, and 4 different kinds of palanquin. These are 6 among a larger number that represent transports. So, you can see. So, again, there's the question of whether it's not that nobody had drawn them. If you look at Thomas Daniel did a series of prints of views of Calcutta twice over. Actually, he did his first set, like Solvyns, in Calcutta itself, and then he repeated them back in London. But he's focusing on the buildings. So you get somebody being carried in a palanquin as a little detail in the foreground or in the background, tiny little things. So the difference with Solvyns is he's focusing on the transport. He gives you an up-close view of the transport. And nowhere is he more thorough than when he turns to his own top subject, shipping. These are 12 of 36 representations of different kinds of vessel used in both coastal and river waters in and around Bengal in the period. And again, you need, actually, if you're really interested in shipping, you need to look at these with the text, because he tells us with every kind of ship, which is minutely distinguished from one from another, he tells us what they were used for, what cargo they were used to carry, whether they're being used for transporting cotton or opium or bricks or coal or whatever, who by, and between which two places. And there's a different kind of boat for every conceivable kind of product and region. And nobody documented it more thoroughly than Baltazard Solvyns. And there are indeed, marine historians who rely on him. So again,
you can see that. You can see that in the prints. You can see how much richer and more dense they are, and with much more detail. Yeah. Right. So we cover it. So then, towards the end of the book, actually, this is an interesting, just in passing, this one called Nations Différentes, or Different Nations. He's trying, this is a capriccio in the sense that he's taking real elements from life and putting them together in an impossible view. The idea was to compress into one image all of the different kinds of people that you would find in Calcutta at the time. So they're representations of, so you've got a couple of Armenians in distinctive Armenian hats. You've got a Malay, a Chinese person. But in the middle of it, he's put himself. And what I think is interesting about this image is that he's shown himself talking. He's got somebody holding an umbrella for him, but he's talking to a woman who's obviously an Indian lady with uncovered hair, by the way, which leads us to think that probably she was Indo-Portuguese. It was not an Indian, not a Bengali style of dress. And here are the Brits. And in the caption, he specifies that these two are English. And notice that we're seeing one of them from behind and the other one's looking down. He's not really engaging with the British. It's a sort of a very good encapsulation of his isolation, I think, from the rest of European society, that he's engaging much more with the Indians than with these two very standoffish Brits over here. Towards the end of the book, in volume 4, he starts all over again with another whole series of portraits, this time of domestic servants. And we go both inside the house and out. So we have people like the coachman, who's obviously out of house, the doria, who's the dog keeper. And again, there's a little bit of useful information here that I hadn't picked up from any other source. The municipal authorities of Calcutta at the end of the 18th century shot dogs on sight in the street. So if you wanted to have a dog, you had to make sure that it was kept in a kennel and looked after. So you would need a doria to look after him, after the dogs. The hekara is a messenger, but someone who runs ahead of your palanquin. We get some women, again, of course, among the servants. We get a regular ayah, the child's maid. She's got a little Gora girl that she's looking after. The dai, or wet nurse, and the metrani, who is a female sweeper. The more elite servants inside the house, there's particularly the so-called banyan. So some of these words are kind of Hobson-Jobson words. Some of them are, if you know what I mean by that, I mean, they're made-up words by the Brits. So some of the servants are given names that an Indian would not have used. Banyan, obviously, it means a merchant, but it's used by the English in the period to refer to their keeper of accounts. So that's what he is, and again, that's why he's shown in a Western interior. The khitmatgar, well, elite Bengali might have had a khitmatgar as well, but this one is obviously working for a European. He's a waiter at table. The Darzi we all know, and that's a kind of timeless image, the Dobie. And one of my favorite images of the whole series actually is of the Vishti, because you can see actually he's carrying his goatskin bag. But also from that
post and the railings. He's at Tank Square. He's in what is now BBD Square, Dalhousie Square, as it was, filling his bag. But it interests me that the Bishti is somebody he describes as coming and going almost unseen. He comes into the house to supply water and then disappears. And because he is very low down the social order because of his goatskin bag, nobody talks to him. And he's seen from behind as if he's a kind of negative presence. There are very few, then, right at the end that are to do with natural history. It's not his strong suit. There's a little bit of representing fruit-bearing trees and crops and one or two animals. As I say, it's very much an afterthought. I think he's just kind of filling up the last pages of Volume 4 by this stage. In his period, that subject is much more thoroughly treated, of course, by company artists. But here's the interesting connection between him and company art. It's not through natural history. Over the years, people have found company paintings representing castes and trades and professions. So it became a well-known form, a genre, if you like, of company painting, to have a whole album representing the different castes or occupations of Indian society. And some of those that are made in Calcutta around 1800, the artists have obviously copied Solvyns' plates. The original version, the Calcutta version, circulated among Indian artists, and when European patrons turned to those Indian artists and said, do us a series of views representing the castes and customs of India, they've got a ready-made template in the work of Solvyns. So sort of the final irony of that story about his lack of success, that the Brits who would not buy his work nevertheless bought work by Indian artists who were copying him. And he ended up, although he's working, he thought, to establish his reputation and his fame in Europe, his real impact is on the history of Indian art, because he ends up being unwittingly, unintentionally, an influence on Indian artists.
So at that point, I just want to say that if you look in the cases as you enter on the site, you can see the very strong influence of Solvyns on the artist, the modeler, they called them modelers at that time, who created the little figurines that are in the case. And that is one of the most interesting aspects about the museum collection, and really the USP about the museum, that it is a sculptural documentation of company school paintings. And you can see different artists have had different, so they copied Forbes, they copied Solvyns, they copied other artists as well. And you can find all of this in our book, by the way, which is also in the shop that we've written about this. But this is what makes the collection of the museum on the upper floor so unique, because you see this art historical trajectory. And it's not just about the documentation, but again, there's a deep history to all of it, and it begs the question of how we are being read and interpreted, and we can keep on. There's a constant revision, a constant looking, and a constant reassessing of all this information. Giles, you want to say something?
Yeah, I'd just say that thank you for drawing attention to the models, which indeed belong to this museum, not to DAG, but they are an important part of the story. I mean, many museums around India, you will find these collections of clay models representing the castes or whatever, different kinds of fakir and so on. They're made in many different places at the end of the 19th century through into the early 20th century. And yeah, someone here has had the idea of giving somebody a copy of Solvyns to use as a model 100 years after
That's right.
their publication, which says something also about ideas about unchanging Indian society, but also about his enduring influence.
And it also just shows how we were accepting the interpretations that were given to us about ourselves. It's very important, to understand that.
Well, again, what I've suggested is that there are many different sources of information which enables somebody to construct their construction, if you like. And if you're looking at a period I made a comparison earlier between an artist who never goes to India. Even at the later period, at DAG, we did an exhibition on Tipu Sultan, which was about British representations of Tipu Sultan. The three major artists who made their fortunes out of making pictures of Tipu Sultan in 1800, even later than this man, never went to India. They did it all sitting at home, based it on narrative accounts that they had read. There's a world of difference between that and someone who lives in Calcutta for 10 years and is conversing all through those 10 years with people on the streets of Calcutta. So I think you've got to look to more than one source for the construction. Yes, we talked about his view of the male body as being based on a European Renaissance ideal.
Yeah, the anatomy is totally about
Yeah.
how the figures.
But I think most of his ideas about how Indian society is constructed
That's what I'm talking
are,
about, the sophistication of this.
yeah.
I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and like to thank Giles. Giles, I can see you're really in a rush because he has a plane to catch. And please enjoy the exhibition. And as I said, there's a book. There's the book that Giles has written, and there's a book that I have written. Both books are available in the bookshop, which is in the museum shop, which is next door. And there's tea and there's more refreshments. Please help yourself. And please look at the exhibition and continue the conversation. Thank you, everybody.